Direct from CBS News Space Headquarters at the Kennedy Space Center, in color. This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite and Harry Reasoner in New York. And in Washington, Dan Rather, Bruce Morton, Stephen Rowan, Hal Walker, David Dick, Mariah McLaughlin, Richard Threlkeld at Firebase Jerry in South Vietnam, and John Hart in New York.
Good evening. As a new nationwide protest against the war began today, President Nixon made a surprise visit to Congress to say thanks for support for his Vietnam policy. Speaking to enthusiastic audiences in both the House and the Senate, Mr. Nixon made no direct reference to the demonstrations, but there was little doubt that the timing of his trip to Capitol Hill was more than coincidental. Dan Rather reports.
In an effort to offset publicity and propaganda from street demonstrations, the president drove to the Capitol to accentuate the positive, the fact that a majority of representatives and senators support his Vietnam policy.
First, an appearance in the House, where the president received a 2-minute standing ovation before his speech and another outburst of standing applause during the address.
As one who has been a member of both bodies, I understand and I respect differences of opinion in both foreign and domestic policy. But I also know this, that when the security of America is involved, when peace for America and for the world is involved, when the lives of our young men are involved, we are not Democrats, we are not Republicans, we are Americans. I can say as I stand here today, I believe that we will achieve a just peace in Vietnam. I believe I cannot tell you the time, the date, but I do know this, that when that peace comes, that it will come because of the support that we have received, not just from Republicans, but from Democrats, from Americans in this House and in the other body and throughout this nation.
In the Senate, where no photographs or recordings are allowed, the president emphasized the same unity theme, but he added a pledge to develop a method for consulting the Senate on the U.S.-Soviet arms limitations talks, which begin in Finland Monday. The Senate speech was shorter than that in the House, but the president seemed to be trying harder to please in the Senate, frequently leaning over the podium and gesturing forcefully. The president told senators, "I know you can't support us 100% of the time. I hope for your understanding, your support when you believe we are right, your criticism when you believe us wrong."
Tomorrow morning, President Nixon flies to Florida to watch the moonshot blast off. He is scheduled to be back in the White House tomorrow afternoon. A spokesman indicates that tentative plans also call for the president to be in the White House Saturday. Dan Rather, CBS News, Washington.
Excuse me, sorry, but do you have anything for a headache? Nothing stronger than aspirin?
You look intelligent. You should know that all the major pain relievers work mainly with aspirin.
Come on.
Look at the labels. They all rely on aspirin.
Aspirin?
Aspirin's what doctors recommend, and Bayer's the only one that's 100% aspirin.
I'll take 2.
Hi, I'm Marlene Francis, and I'd like to test your judgment. Which of these antacid tablets would you say is stronger? I mean, which do you think settles more of the acid that causes heartburn or indigestion? Well, once again, the biggest is not the best. The smaller Phillips tablet is concentrated, so it's stronger than either of the leading antacid tablets that come in a roll. There is no contest. Phillips tablets are stronger. You like them.
Anti-war activity occurred in many of the nation's cities and towns, but the center of the 3 days of demonstrations is the nation's capital. There, a 40-hour march against death is just getting underway. Hal Walker reports.
Most of the processions across this bridge are funerals. They go the other way, from Washington, D.C. to Arlington National Cemetery. But these participants in the March Against Death are taking their march from Arlington to Washington. After a brief religious service at the end of the bridge, the marchers are setting off on a 4-mile trek past the White House to the Capitol. Each marcher carries the name of a Vietnam War dead, or the name of a bombed-out Vietnamese village, or the names of the states from which these victims have come. They will shout out the names they carry as they pass the White House. The marchers leave here at the rate of about 1 every 3 seconds, and as they leave, others come by the busloads to take their place. In this way, they hope to stretch out this march against death for 40 hours and 46,000 names. Hal Walker, CBS News, Arlington.
The protest activity in Washington during the day took many forms. Thousands of troops were available to keep order, but they weren't needed. A report now from a CBS News team. First, Mariah McLaughlin.
About a half an hour before President Nixon entered the Capitol through a side entrance, about 900 staff members from Senate and House offices gathered on the steps of the East Front for a 45-minute silent vigil to show concern about the Vietnam War. About twice that number had participated last month during the moratorium. Backer said the relatively small showing did not reflect a lack of interest in this month's anti-war protest, but rather a preoccupation with the big demonstration on Saturday.
At the Pentagon, a group of Episcopalian clergymen and supporters, led by the Right Reverend Edward Crowther, former Bishop of Kimberley, South Africa, went to one end of the vast, dimly lit main concourse to conduct what they called a Mass for Peace. Some of them had been arrested for loitering during similar services earlier this year, but found not guilty. Today, they were challenging new regulations against disrupting normal business activities in federal buildings.
Let us pray for the state of the church, for all those who resist oppression, for all those who...
Of the crowd of about 250 who were taking part, 186 unprotestingly walked outside to be arrested. And some 200 or 300 Pentagon employees who had been interested spectators, only about 1% of those who work in the building, went back to their normal business activities.
They were practicing in the final hours what they would do if there was violence. This is a parade marshal's training school. Lesson for the day: we are here for peace. We do not seek violence, we do not want it. But if it happens, we will try to cool it.
Keep the people moving first, because that's the most important thing. Right. And then try and restore as much order as possible, telling them to ignore the fight even if, something has developed, and keep them going. Number two, I wouldn't lay hands on somebody in a sense of pulling them apart. Maybe I'd come up, first of all, to your guy that's jumped the guy and say, hey, man, what are you doing? We're not here to fight. Cool it, and maybe just touch him on the shoulder or something and ask him to come away and see what he would, and see how he reacts to that. Okay, let's say you get slugged. Okay. No matter what then you say, hey, you just slugged your own marshal. Why did you do it? Come on, let's come over here. Come on away from that guy. All he did was rip up a placard. We've got lots of placards. We're not here to defend placards. We're here with a much bigger message, and that message is people have died, and this has got to stop.
Not all the demonstration today was against the war. Some expressed support for the president's policy with the now familiar signals of flying flag or burning auto headlights, and in Wyoming, burning porch lights. And in Jackson, Michigan, 16 parents whose sons were killed in Vietnam signed a petition for a court order to prevent war protesters from using their sons' names.
We know what you're up to. You're trying to clean your engine to help your car get more power and better mileage. It's a good idea, but there's a much easier way. Help clean inside your engine with mobile detergent gasoline. We clean up what most gasolines make dirty.
Benson & Hedges 100s must taste pretty good. Look what people put up with to smoke them.
Most participants in the demonstrations are expected to be ordinary citizens expressing deep concern about the war. But the planners of the activity, the new mobilization, represent a strange alliance of organizations. Bruce Morton reports.
The new mobilization is a big, floppy umbrella, a loose, sometimes quarrelsome coalition of old left, new left, and ordinary liberals. It does not include the Yippies nor the Students for a Democratic Society. Its 60-member-plus steering committee does include a member of the Communist Party and 2 members of the Trotskyite Socialist Workers' Party. One speaker at Saturday's rally is Carol Lipman of the Student Mobilization, a Trotskyite Marxist, though she says her organization's only position is on ending the war. One of the MOB's co-chairmen is Sidney Lenz, an old-line labor movement radical who thinks the Communist Party is old-fashioned. Sidney Peck, a college professor, an independent radical, a co-chairman at whose Cleveland University the conference which began the new MOB was held. Stuart Meacham of the American Friends Service Committee, less political than Lenz or Peck, but equally anti-war. Mrs. Cora Weiss of the Women's Strike for Peace, like Meacham, a co-chairman, wife of a New York lawyer, and a moderate in the arguing over how the protests should go. And co-chairman David Dellinger, the independent radical leader now on trial in Chicago for conspiracy to create disorder at the 68 Democratic Convention. Other organizations with someone on the steering committee range from the W.E.B. Du Bois Club to church groups and the Urban Coalition. The left-wing flavor is strongest in the language, end U.S. imperialism, and so on. But the MOB has had to seek traditional liberal help in organizing. And on major questions like the pledge of a peaceful, legal demonstration, the moderates won. The Communist Party man was a strong supporter of nonviolence. As for money, the MOB is in trouble. The organizers hope that selling buttons and other items during the mass march will be profitable, but as of now, the MOB is in debt. Its leaders estimate expenses here at over $130,000. As for income, one former McCarthy supporter gave $5,000, but spokesmen say they've had only a handful of contributions over $1,000. Some labor unions have helped, so has the American Friends Service Committee. The MOB had borrowed $20,000 as of 2 days ago, and the buttons will have to sell briskly. All in all, it's a funny coalition, ranging from whatever Leon Trotsky stands for these days to orthodox liberals who've never read him. It is less well-organized, less well-financed than last month's Vietnam moratorium. But the leaders have ended up optimistic that somehow their protest will be large, peaceful, and maybe even solvent. Bruce Morton, CBS News, Washington.
Senate Republican leader Scott today urged government officials to listen more closely to the complaints of the young. In a speech, he said that violence cannot be tolerated and every impatient whim cannot be served. Nevertheless, Scott said, the younger generation is not blind and it is trying to tell us something. The defense in the Chicago Convention conspiracy trial wants to see the raw material for the study report which labeled the violence a police riot. The director of the study, Daniel Walker, told the court today that the material is now in the National Archives. The defense then said it intends to subpoena the executive director of the Violence Commission in an effort to get the documents. In Chicago today, a policeman and a youth identified with the Black Panther Party were killed in a gun battle that left 8 others wounded, 7 of them policemen. The fight erupted after police were called to the area by a woman who reported seeing a man with a shotgun in a vacant building. Police said at least 3 snipers opened fire. One of the alleged gunmen escaped. Another, wounded and in custody, carried Black Panther literature, according to police. In New York City today, 3 men and 2 women were charged by the FBI with 9 bombings of Manhattan skyscrapers and government buildings, explosions dating back to July. 2 of the men were arrested last night as they allegedly attempted to place explosives on U.S. Army trucks outside an armory. There have been injuries, but no deaths in the explosions, with damage estimated at $250,000. Anonymous letters sent to the news media proclaimed the bombings as blows against big business, the government, and the military. President Nixon today ordered a development of a 10-year prison reform plan. In an appalling number of cases, the president said, our correctional institutions are failing. He directed Attorney General Mitchell to make the federal penal system into a model for state and local institutions. One of the goals the president outlined is the separation of youthful offenders from older, hardened criminals. In a speech prepared for delivery tonight, Vice President Agnew makes a scathing attack on television news, accusing the major broadcasts of often presenting a narrow and distorted picture of America. The speech will be carried over many of these CBS stations immediately following this broadcast.
Bloodstains virtually gone. Jane gets everything unbelievably clean.
That's hard to believe. Your stains come clean, but these stains were set in Harold's shirt yesterday.
Jane will get them out.
When Harold gets stains, they never come out.
Well, let's see those stains.
All right. Harold, hamburger, chocolate ice cream.
Grass and mud.
They're in the stay. Gain can't get those out.
Sure it can. Gain's not a conventional detergent. Look at the box. Microenzyme action. Gain treats stains like dirt. You see, stains are locked into fabric fibers, but Gain's enzymes act like little keys to unlock stains.
Where are the stains?
Grass and mud stains, chocolate ice cream, hamburger. Virtually gone, gone, gone.
That's...
Unbelievable?
Yes.
Everything's unbelievably clean with the unbelievable detergent. Gain treats stains like dirt.
At the Paris peace talks today, Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge told the communists that the majority of the American people and Congress support President Nixon's policy in Vietnam. Both communist delegations derided Mr. Nixon's November 3rd speech and made it clear they are counting upon increasing opposition by the American people to end the war. In Vietnam, the pace of the enemy's winter offensive intensified today as the North Vietnamese launched their heaviest ground attack near the demilitarized zone in more than a year. 500 enemy troops attempted to overrun an American armored company in night bivouac below the zone. 17 Americans were killed, 104 enemy bodies were counted. In 2 days of fighting in the area, a total of 22 Americans have died and more than 50 have been wounded. In other action, communist gunners hit the Special Forces camps at Bu Prang and Duc Lap again today. There was no immediate report of casualties. We have a report from Richard Threlkeld at Firebase Jerry near the Bu Dap Special Forces camp.
The battle for Bu Dap is supposed to be an all-Vietnamese operation, but it's becoming more Americanized every day. American helicopters and fighter planes raking the North Vietnamese positions that surround the Special Forces camp, and an all-American fire base known as Jerry. The 1st Air Cavalry Division reoccupied this abandoned fire base only 5 days ago, and now, like Bu Dap, Jerry is surrounded and under siege. Now these Americans are racing against time to build new bunkers before enemy artillery zeroes in on Jerry. For some, the race has already been lost. 5 GIs have been killed and 11 wounded here at Jerry today alone. Moving around is done at one's own risk. The operational commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ronald Rasmussen, took the same risk when he paused for a moment to answer a question.
Colonel, what do you think the enemy's intentions are for the Bu Dap area as a result of the last week's action?
Well, I think he has 2 things in mind. First of all, he'd like to upset the pacification program here in this particular district. And secondly, if the opportunity presents itself, he'd like to overrun the district headquarters.
Do you think the new pressure here...
Keep rolling.
This is exactly the way it's been at Firebase Jerry for the last 24 hours. You never know when that terrible, frightening word, incoming, is going to start. And there it is.
This time, the enemy gunners were off their mark, and the shells exploded in a momentarily deserted section of the base. Jerry's defenders retaliated by firing their howitzers point-blank into the enemy positions only 30 yards beyond the perimeter. CBS cameraman Pham Boi Hoan and soundman Pham Tan Zan repeatedly exposed themselves to enemy fire to film these scenes. A reconnaissance platoon was sent out to find the enemy mortar and ran right into a big enemy bunker. Outmanned and outgunned, the Americans beat a hasty retreat to the relative safety of the barbed wire perimeter, firing back from behind the trenches, World War I style. Helicopter gunships moved in to rocket the enemy bunkers, striking so close that shrapnel fragments whistled over Jerry's own sandbags. Firebase Jerry was reopened to give the South Vietnamese some help, but Jerry's defenders are now spending most of their time defending themselves. And there's a growing suspicion here that it is the Americans, not the South Vietnamese troops, who are the real enemy targets. Most of the Americans at Jerry are newcomers to combat. It's taken only 5 days here to make them veterans.
So that's the way it goes at Firebase Jerry, the newest North Vietnamese target. A few minutes of hard work and a few minutes of hell and fear. You may get used to it, but you never get over it. Richard Threlkeld, CBS News, Fire Base Jerry, South Vietnam.
Weekly casualty figures released today reflect the increased fighting and the larger role being played by South Vietnamese forces. 97 Americans were reported killed, 14 more than the previous week. Nearly 700 Americans were wounded. South Vietnamese dead totaled 476, almost double the death toll for the previous week. Enemy deaths were put at more than 2,400. 14 days ago, former Green Beret Commander Colonel Robert Rowe resigned from the Army after 23 years as a career officer. Rowe was the second of 8 Green Berets who had been charged with the murder of an alleged Vietnamese double agent to quit the services after the charges were dropped. John Hart interviewed Rowe in New York today. He asked him whether death in war should ever be connected with a normal legal process.
Death in war, death is part of war. And there's no process of law involved in death. A pilot flies over a military target, releases his bombs, people are killed. The North Vietnamese claim that our pilots who are being held in Hanoi, in the suburbs of Hanoi, are war criminals because they have killed Vietnamese civilians. I don't believe that you or I or anybody else subscribe to that theory. They're not murderers. Neither are people who conduct ground warfare. I just fail to understand this point of view. Warfare has always posed deep moral and ethical questions, and will continue to do so because it involves killing people. But soldiers have not been treated as murderers.
Would you consider those Viet Cong who executed what we now count as 3,000 people in Hue as war criminals?
Not knowing the facts in the situation, but certainly from what little I know, it would seem that what they have done in that case would fall into that category. It seems that these were innocent civilians in the area who were herded out and shot. But I really don't like to stand in judgment over anybody without knowing all of the facts. From what it appears that way.
Would that apply to Americans who also execute civilians?
Yes, I would say so. In other words, if you had a comparable case,
General Duong Van Minh, popular leader of the 1963 coup d'etat in South Vietnam, said today that most South Vietnamese do not support the present Saigon government, nor do they support the communists. Minh proposed setting up a People's Congress representing the majority with which government leaders would consult. The House Government Operations Committee today urged the Army to stop immediately testing poison gas in the open air. The committee's report also accused the Army of a lack of candor, deception, and disregard of the public interest in the field of chemical and biological warfare. In the report's words, there is no adequate justification for such secrecy. The Senate today began formal debate on the nomination of Judge Clement Haynsworth to the Supreme Court. At the start, Missouri's Stuart Symington aligned himself with the opposition. Symington told his colleagues he believes Haynsworth is an honest man, but that he failed to exercise sufficient care in the area of judicial ethics. Another senator who was uncommitted, Kansas Republican James Pearson, came out for Haynsworth. The averages were off sharply on the New York Stock Exchange today. Volume was 12 million shares. The New York index lost 24 cents. The American Exchange Index was down 20 cents.
Dinner rolls tonight.
Pillsbury Crescents.
Hi, I'm Poppin' Fresh, the Pillsbury Doughboy. Now, let's get doing.
Pillsbury Crescents from the dairy case. They're layered like fine pastry to bake up light and flaky. Poppin' Fresh dough says fresh, hot crescent dinner rolls. And Pillsbury says it best.
What are you doing for dinner tonight? The Danish are coming! The Danish are coming!
Orange Danish. caramel with nuts, and cinnamon Danish. Pillsbury Danish sweet rolls, made from poppin' fresh dough with lots of cinnamon and a rich home-baked aroma. Just top with creamy icing and serve. Try all the Pillsbury Danish sweet rolls, fresh from the dairy case.
Better put on the coffee. Whoops, the Danish are here.
For the second time in his history, man sets forth for the moon tomorrow. Walter Cronkite reports on the latest developments from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
Tonight, the launch crew appears to be winning its fight to send Apollo 12 on its way to the moon tomorrow morning. That small fuel tank, which caused trouble yesterday, was replaced today and ahead of schedule. The weather forecast for tomorrow is cloudy with possible showers, but space officials say that will be all right. It's been raining most of the day, is raining right now. Our color coverage of the launch begins with the CBS Morning News at 7 a.m. Eastern Time. President Nixon is coming down to watch this launch. From today, he announced that he is promoting the 43-year-old former manager of the Apollo program, George Low, to be Deputy Administrator of the Civilian Space Agency. That agency, NASA, was criticized sharply today by a White House panel of scientists. Their report accused NASA of ignoring for almost a decade expert advice on ways to determine whether long-range manned spaceflight is feasible. As a result, the report said neither NASA nor anyone else knows enough about man's ability to survive in space to talk now about months-long flights to distant places like Mars. Getting back to the immediate future of space travel, Pete Conrad, the Apollo 12 commander, recently gave David Shoemaker this answer as to how it would feel to be a historical footnote as the third man on the moon.
Well, I think that's really great myself. Like anybody in the office, I would have loved to have been the first man on the moon, but I'm not sure that after I was the first man on the moon, I would want to have to suffer all the things that Neil's going to have to suffer, and Buzz and Mike for the rest of their lives. And our business really is the flying end, and I don't think any of us are here for the fame and glory. And so I'm quite happy to have the second flight. And like every flight in the program, the next flight really is doing something more and different, so there is no such thing as a bad flight anywhere in the program as far as we're concerned.
That's the way it is. Thursday, November 13th, 1969. T-1. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News, Kennedy Space Center.